Yeah.
And I put a pretty good amount of thought in that. So, Global Solidarity is the name of the show today because I think that is the focus, or that should be the focus. We need to focus on solidarity across nations, across continents, across economic positions. You know, that's where the power lies. You know, we know it's true because of how much effort the powers that be put forth in getting us to be divided, to be at each other's throats, to look at our neighbor as our enemy, you know, putting us in compartments, putting us in boxes, and telling us that other box is your problem, you know. It's the bait and switch. It's the distraction. It works. It works really well, especially given the media landscape that we have completely captured by, economic interests. They what we see is so controlled and so manipulated and so, you know, it leads us to a certain perspective. We don't get a good view of what how things really are. And then we have these people that we look up to, these people that we think are really smart. In a lot of cases, they are, and we go by what they say. That's what informs us, and that's what helps us have the positions that we have on things. But in a lot of cases, we just don't have good information. We don't have good data. And they know this, and they know this, and so they just give us the little bit that leads us to think in a certain way. And the way that we think benefits them, you know. So we have to take it upon ourselves to get the data, to get the information, to not be afraid to have perspectives that are different than what we think the mainstream views are. You know, a lot of like people, you got the woke word that I really don't like to use, but you're either woke or you're anti woke or whatever, but it depends on who, you know, what how they define that word. And you can feel like you're having the not mainstream perspective, and come to find out that you're actually having the main your anti-mainstream perspective is actually the mainstream perspective, or that's the perspective that they want you to have, you know. And then you have times where you think that you don't have the mainstream perspective because of what you see in the media or whatever. But then when you talk to people, you find out that a lot of people agree with the way you're thinking about things. People are afraid, people are really afraid of saying how they really feel about things and how they really view things. Uh, we, 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 we like to talk about freedom of speech, but we hold our own. How do I say this? We police each other when it comes to that. Even in just regular conversations that you're having with your coworkers and your friends or whatever, we police each other with what's acceptable and what's not, or whatever, within our little groups that we have. And you're not supposed to say that. You're not supposed to think that way. That's wrong or whatever. So the the powers that be, they don't even have to do it. We do it ourselves. We snitch on our neighbors. We turn our friends in to the to the police or whatever. And it doesn't have to be as complex or as formal as like actually calling the police. It's like telling your boss, you know, this person came back from their break too late or something like that. I mean, I don't really know where I'm going with this, but what I'm saying is, we need to find solidarity with each other in these times. We need to find a way to find the things that we agree on and start there. You know, instead of starting at that point that we disagree. You know, and we also have to stop looking at these nations as these arbitrary borders, these imaginary lines, as something that separates us. And we have to look around the world. We live in a global world. Like, there's no denying that. There's no way to avoid that. These people, these corporations or whatever, they don't have any real solidarity to the nations that they operate in. They're not looking at the world in that way at all. So we can't look at the world in that way either. We have to find the solidarity in peoples that are going through the same things that we are going through within our nation and without, because we're way more similar to each other, the people that are struggling and going through the things that we're going through in other nations, than we are with these corporations and these billionaires. We don't we're we don't have very much in common with them. Now, they might have the same passport as us. They may even reside in the same city as us, but they live in a totally different world from us, and their perspective on the world is completely different from ours. So, and they're not your friend. They're not on your side. They're not looking out for you. Okay. So people that are going through the same struggles that you're going through are more likely to sympathize or empathize with your situation or even understand it. I think that some of these people, like, they totally live in a different world and they completely could not understand people who live check to check, people who just make ends meet every month, people who are concerned about their bills, you know, they're budgeting their groceries, you know. These people, they can't possibly get into that mind frame. Like, they could not understand. And then they it's like, you must have done something wrong, you did something wrong, or your parents did something wrong, or you didn't work hard enough, you know go get another job. I already have two jobs. Well, get a third job. you know do what you need to do to be able to not be in the position that you're in. And I mean, that's a fairly fair argument, except that, there's situations and scenarios that's impossible. Like, you know, maybe you get a fourth job or whatever, but how many hours of the day do you have? Like, you need time to sleep, you know, you need time to wash your clothes and wash dishes and deflate and relax, you know. There's only so many hours in a day, and, like, you know what they say, like, the rich person has the same number of hours in a day as the poor person does or whatever. And that's true. And that's true, but that rich person has a different set of resources. They have a different situation than that poor person does. And it's like the poor person is lazy, and that's the reason why they're in the position that they're in. And, that may be true for some, but that is definitely not true for all. You know, the people are out here grinding, they're putting in work. It means more to them, when they get to go to the movies, or they get to, travel or take a trip or whatever. Maybe they do it fewer times than others, but it means more to them. They put in the grind. They put in those extra hours. They worked overtime. They sacrificed here and there, to be able to do that, and it has more meaning to them. So, there's positives and negatives to all the different sides of this.